Alrighty, looks like we are live. So, welcome everyone to another Properties and Beers, and I promise we'll find the beers soon. But let me ask you a question. What if an investment option you'd been planning to use was about to change before you ever got started? For Aussies looking at buying residential property through a SMSF or a self-managed super fund, that question has become very real. Look, if the SMSF property investing has been sitting in your I'll look into in one day list, tonight's episode for you, because here's the thing. And by the way, I'm going to do things a little bit differently, right? I'm going to throw in some of my favorite quotes from Tony Robbins and other inspirational people. So here's something that I created recently. Clarity creates confidence. Confidence creates action, and actions creates options. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Properties and Beers. My name is Goro Gupta, CEO and founder of Ethical Property Investments. We help everyday Aussies build wealth through high cash flow property strategies that create positive outcomes for communities while generating strong positive cash flow for investors. In tonight's session, it's important. Look, over the last few years, we've seen some major developments out of Canberra. Few years. Over the last few days, we've seen some major developments out of Canberra that could affect thousands of Aussies who've been considering putting their property investment through their self-managed super fund. Look, the federal government, with support from the Greens, they moved to restrict SMSFs from using limited recourse borrowing arrangements to buy residential property. Now, if you thought that was a bunch of gobbledygook, let me translate that to pure English, right? So what that basically means is that if you're looking to get a loan for your property in self-managed super fund, they're going to restrict that. By restrict, they mean no more for a residential property. So existing arrangements, they're basically expected to be protected or grandfathered, right? There's a magic word that we've been hearing in the media all the time. SMSFs can still invest in residential property where they're using their own fund capital. So if you've got a spare $1 million sitting in your SMSF, you can still do it, right? No one's stopping you buying in them, but you can't get any more loans, right? So borrowing for commercial property, though, still remains available. And I'm sure there was some negotiation on that left on the table. So for residential SMSF borrowing, the window's basically closing. So please get personal advice before making decisions around super, lending, tax, or property. Tonight's general commentary, not education, because, look, the details can change the outcome, right? But tonight's message is simple. Pay attention early, understand your position, and move with the proper guidance. And, look, if you were with us last week on Properties and Beers, you'll remember we launched a cash flow safety net. I want to chat about that as well, because that conversation connects directly with tonight's topic. Because, look, policy changes are one more reminder that investors need more than hope. They need structure, right? Waiting is still a decision. Waiting often lets someone else set the terms, right? Tonight, we're going to talk about what's happened, what it could mean for investors, and how to build a portfolio that can withstand all these changing governments, policies, and changing market conditions. Let's jump in now. You're on Properties and Beers. You're not Properties and not Beers today. So what do we have today? We have Amply Simply Alcoholic Ginger Beer, right? I did get the zero sugar version. Those that have known, I do not like super sweet drinks, so let's get it started. And, because I like to do good and make money, we're going to pour in the do good and make money cup. And, let's give it a go. Cheers, guys. Oh, that's nice. That's really nice. Now, guys, Amply's spicy alcoholic. It's nice. Get in here. Right? So let's talk about the self-managed super fund borrowing changes. So let me start with a simple question. How many people have been meaning to look into SMSF property investment for the last year or two? I know some of my clients have, some of my friends and family have, right? Maybe you've spoken to an accountant, maybe you've watched a webinar, maybe you've bought it, maybe you've got a decent super balance building up, and maybe you've thought, I'll get around to it when things settle down. That's exactly why this update deserves your attention, right? So if you've been living under a rock, the federal government has reached a deal with the Greens as part of its broader tax reform package. That one part of the deal is a restriction on new residential property purchases, right? Through borrowings on SMSFs using basically loans or what they call limited recourse borrowing arrangements. In America, if you're watching from America, we have, most of your loans are limited recourse borrowing. We have a special term for that here in Australia, right? As reported this week, the change is expected to apply to new investments from 45 days after the relevant amendments receive what they call the royal assent, which is gobbledygook, once again, for for basically when they're going to present in Parliament. Depending on the final timing, which is likely to be in a fortnight, new residential SMSF borrowing could effectively close around mid-August, right? So who's affected? So if you've already purchased a property through SMSF and your borrowing arrangements are already in place, current reporting suggests that those structures are expected to be grandfathered. Now, if you're genuinely underway, this transition provisions may affect your position. And this is where your accountant, advisor, solicitor, lender, they all become critical right now, right? These are people who haven't started yet and need to pay the closest attention. It's a timing issue, right? And I see this all the time, right? People, they spend years doing this research. They spend years preparing. They spend years waiting for the perfect moment, for the perfect return, for this perfect property, which doesn't exist. And then the rules freaking change on them, right? The opportunity they assume that would always be available suddenly has a deadline attached to it. Now, the future gets built by the decisions you're willing to make before the conditions feel perfect. So if SMS investing forms part of your long-term strategy, it's time to understand the options is now, right? So this means getting proper guidance around setup, lending, structure, timeframe, and suitability is really important. It means knowing where you stand before the market, the lender, or legislation makes that decision for you. And this brings us to a bigger question. Why we're seeing these types of policy changes in the first place. Now, before I go into why, I do want to let you know where things are at, right? And before I go controversial, right? So if you already have an SMSF set up and a BEAR set up, you might have a short window to get your approvals through and figure out which property you want to buy. Now, if you don't have a good advisor around property, find one or feel free to reach out to us. We do have some properties, which I might share with you some numbers around in terms of SMSF, but we're properties generating anywhere from 50 to $150,000 available for your SMSF purchase right now. So if you are looking and you've got your BEAR trust set up, you've got your finance approved for sort of that circa 1.1, 1.2 mark. We have them available. We even have one available at that 1.4 mark, which is generating, which is supposed to generate about 180K. It's not for everyone. Once again, if you want to know more, drop us a line. If you want to know anything about that, right? Those are SMSF friendly properties. So the number two thing I'd like to chat about is why are we seeing these policy changes in the first place, right? And is this really about housing affordability? Now, watch out. I need a horse to get on because I'm going to get on my high horse right now. But one of the narratives I hear repeatedly is housing's become too expensive and property values have increased dramatically over time, right? And yes, property values have increased significantly. Australia, we live in such a little bubble. We think we're unique. We're not. The United States has seen similar pressure. Larger parts of Europe have seen similar pressure. Many developed economies have seen similar pressure where the cost of housing has quadrupled in the last 20 years. We're not freaking unique. Look at the USA. Type in how much does the US house property prices grow over the last 20 years into Google. You'll find a very similar answer to Australia, right? So when people point to housing values increasing dramatically over the last couple of decades, ask a deeper question, right? And the deeper question is, what are the forces underneath the headline? Population growth, urbanization, rising construction costs, increasing taxes on build. By the way, your taxes on build since 2019 have increased by over 100%. To over 50% of any new build goes towards taxes, right? There's labor shortages, there's land constraints, there's inflation, there's infrastructure investment, there's planning bottlenecks. And all of these factors, they influence the housing markets deeply, right? And yes, immigration does play a part, but you've got all those other laundry lists of items. You can't blame one or two things. It's a culmination of these things, right? But here's the uncomfortable part. Australia says we need more homes, right? We need more rentals. We need more affordable options and we need more supply. At the same time, a lot of the policy conversation keeps drifting back to making private investors more cautious, less confident, less willing to really participate in this form of investment that really subsidizes housing on behalf of the government, if we really think about it, right? And that has real consequences, right? Because the renters, they live in actual homes. Actual homes, they need capital. They need builders. They need developers. They need lenders. And they need investors willing to take the risk. And the housing debate often gets reduced to a simple villain story. Investors, they become the villains. They get blamed. First-time buyers, they get positioned as the only group worth protecting. The reality, my friends, is a lot more complex, right? First-time buyers, they deserve a fair shot. They deserve a fair go, right? We live in a lucky country where everyone gets a fair go, right? First-time buyers definitely deserve that. Renters, they also deserve enough homes to choose from. Essential workers need housing. Students need housing. Older Aussies need housing. People with disabilities need housing. Families going through these transition periods, they need housing. And private investment from retail mum and dad investors is a major part of how housing gets delivered in our country. Look, a complex market rewards people who stay calm, prepare early, and move with purpose. Because when policy makes investors more cautious, we've got to be honest about the consequences, because confidence can fall, projects can be delayed, capital can move elsewhere, and rental supply can become even tighter, which is what we're seeing right now. In a country that's already struggling to build enough homes, I was reading a stat today. One of my friends posted up, George, if you're watching, thank you for this stat. And he said we're short by over 200,000 homes at the moment, right? We're already struggling to build these homes, right? That should make every investor pay attention, because I'm interested in the bigger picture. Good investors, they don't make decisions based on headlines. They make decisions by understanding the forces underneath the headlines, right? Now, before I go further into the real housing problem, I'm going to have a drink, and please drop me a line, say hi. Those that are just joining me, I'm having simply alcoholic, spicy alcoholic ginger beer. Geez, I can't say it out loud today for some reason. Now, the real housing problem. Here's where I want to be direct. Australia's got plenty of opinions about housing. Australia needs more housing. That's the core issue. When supply's tight, every single policy decision we make has a consequence. If you make it harder for investors to buy, some of them are going to step back. Make tax settings less predictable, then confidence reduces. That creates uncertainty around build to rent. And institutional capitals also become more selective, right? And, you know, with the new tranche 2 AML CTF regulations coming up, that's going to restrict foreign capital that could help fund more projects, right? And I'm not saying that people are going to do the wrong thing, right? And we do have, there's some things that we need to do as part of our anti-money laundering system. But at the same time, if we put in too many restrictions, people are going to go, well, just take my money elsewhere, because those projects, they become harder to stack up, right? And the other thing that happens especially is NIMBYism, right? We're leaving planning approvals and construction costs high, then supply is going to stay constrained. And you know what? When you have less supply, less people can afford to rent, less houses get built. Where do people, yes, we want first-time buyers to build such a small portion of the market, right? What about the people who cannot afford the deposit on their homes? Forget this 5% deposit stuff. Their serviceability might not allow them to buy a home, right? You can't regulate your way into a housing boom without people willing to build and fund the homes, right? Someone's got to create the dwelling. Someone's got to carry the risk. Someone's got to make the numbers work. And I believe every investor brings a unique approach. Some investment, it's lazy. Some is speculative. Some investment adds very little value. Serious investors, though, they need to separate themselves from that category. And these are the investors coming out and investing with us right now. These are the serious investors, right? They help create more bedrooms through a co-living, is adding real utility to the housing system, right? And investors specializing in specialist disability accommodation in the right place is supporting a genuine housing need where other houses don't exist. An investor buying with long-term cash flow focused strategy is building with discipline. And that distinction, I believe, should get more attention, not just with people like us on our little bubble, but people out there in the larger media, right? It should get more distinction from the government. And I'm going to be lobbying for that, for our cash flow based investors who are ready to do good for society, right? And like I say, right, do good, make money. We should be getting more validation about why that's more important, right? Because I believe the future belongs to investors that can show that the capital improves the housing market, right? Creating more supply, better use of existing dwellings, more appropriate housing, more resilient rental options, and better outcomes for tenants and the communities that surround them. Because the strongest position in any market is usefulness. When your investment solves a real problem, you get to build more than wealth. You get to build relevance. You get to build legacy. And that's where I think the opportunity is really moving. The better question is no longer, how do I buy property? The better question is actually, how do I own property in a way that still makes sense when the political spotlight is on the investors and turning them into the bad guys, right? So here's the real risk some investors face, right? Now, before I go into that, I still need to have my beverage. So Remember, do good, make money, guys. Now, here's a real risk investors face. When most people think about investment risk, they think about interest rates or vacancies or property prices. Those risks, my friends, they're real. That's where another risk often gets overlooked. And that's policy risk, right? The risk that governments are going to change the tax settings, the risk that lending rules change, the risk that incentives change, the risk that structures you are planning to use become less accessible. We're seeing an example of that right now, right? So the broader package, in the new reforms is also included change of capital gains tax, negative gearing settings for future purposes, and investment rules that are expected to apply from 1st of July 2027. Tonight is about what teaches us to sorry, guys. Tonight is about what changes teaches us as investors. Policy settings, they're never guaranteed to stay the same forever, right? Investors built their entire strategy around one benefit. They might need to rethink their assumptions because investors plan to use SMSF borrowing for several years from now. They're going to discover that pathways changed. That's why I always encourage people to focus on fundamentals first: income, cash flow, asset quality, debt management, and flexibility. These are the 5 principles that they remain valuable across governments, market cycles, headlines, because this is just a market cycle that's happening, right? Now, over the years, we've seen these lending restrictions, tax adjustments. We've seen these planning changes and regulatory changes. I know there were headlines that say markets crashing, skies falling, etc., etc. And you know what? If it bleeds, it leads. The reality is, we also had the same thing in 2008. We had the same thing in 2000. We had the same thing in 2017. We had the same thing in 2020. Right? It happens on a regular basis where the media headlines are screaming crash, right? I remember at the start of 2020, it was Westpac or someone that was saying, oh, yeah, property prices are going to fall by 30%. How did that headline go, right? At the end of the day, the environment, it evolves constantly, and investors need to evolve with it. Right now, because of the fear in the media, there's a damn lot of good deals out there. Because a strong investor, they don't need the perfect condition. A strong investor needs a clear strategy, enough buffer, and courage to act with discipline. At the end of the day, look, here's the thing, right? I've seen investors, they spend years planning around a particular rule or incentive. They then discover that this landscape's changed well before they're ready to act. And that is the reality, right? When your entire future depends on one policy setting remaining unchanged, you give away more control than you actually realize. The investors who tend to sleep better at night, they understand that change is part of investing. They build flexibility into their plans. They build buffers into their plans. They focus on assets that can stand on their own merits. And these investments, they create options. Which brings you to the most important part of tonight's discussion is how do you build a portfolio that can handle the uncertainty, the shit that's going on right now? How do you handle that, right? And that's what I call building an all-weather portfolio. Look, if there's one lesson investors have got to take from this week, is that governments, they're going to continue changing things, right? Governments are going to change. Policy are going to change. Market cycles are going to change. So how do you prepare? For me, it starts with income. Because one of the reasons we've spent so much time helping Aussies acquire cash flow positive property is because I believe cash flow creates choices. Repeat after me. Cash flow creates choices, right? A cash flow positive property gives you the breathing room we're in the current market that's desperately needed. And that's why we launched the cash flow safety net, right? The real fear from many investors having to, that they hold is being underwater, where the rent doesn't cover the mortgage. This whole thing called negative gearing helps subsidize that. But the holding costs creep up and the asset starts taking the oxygen from the rest of your portfolio and the rest of your family's net income. So what we do is we engineered around a rental baseline around standard mortgage costs, right? So what we've done is that we've gone one step better than a rental guarantee, because a rental guarantee is a promise layered on top of a deal. A cash flow safety net is engineered baseline into the strategy. It's actually built for sophisticated investors who like to keep it real. We're not talking fairy floss, no false comfort, just a disciplined way to look at cash flow before you commit, right? When the numbers give you breathing room, your decisions get stronger. And that's one of the things that makes ethical property investments stand apart. So if you're wondering what a cash flow safety net is, and if you weren't watching last week, really simple. What it is that we will make sure whatever location we put your property in, it's in a high cash flow location. Now, if it doesn't, and this is only applicable to some sort of properties, and there's some guidance around it, if it doesn't, within 60 days, achieve higher rent than what your mortgage is, we'll pay the difference until it does. That's a safety net. That's very different to a guarantee. We haven't padded the building contract with all that sort of stuff. We don't play that game, and we've been here for a long time. So anything we say, I stand to, right? So what we do is we look for property that can support itself, it support the investor, and create a positive outcome for the people who live there, right? That's why I'm so in love with what we do, right? Positive cash flow can help you hold the assets longer during difficult periods like what we have now. Positive cash flow can help you support you when the interest rates move. Positive cash flow can create that flexibility when lending environments tighten. And positive cash flow, yes, I said that word again, I'm going to keep saying it, can help investors adapt when the external conditions change. Look, here's the thing. With our company at Ethical Property Investments, we've spent years researching what works and what doesn't work and applying the strategies that perform across changing conditions, whether it's co-living, whether it's special accessibility accommodation, or other opportunities that are focused on sustainable income generation. That, my friends, is becoming very important because I believe the investor of the next decade needs more than the old playbook. The investors who are best positioned to carry can answer 3 questions clearly, and write this down, right? A, does your property produce strong income? B, can it solve a real housing need? And C, can I hold it when the rules change around me? That mindset is a long way from buying something purely because someone told you property always goes up. Because isn't that the lie that we've all been sold? The stronger version of property investing is more disciplined. This is what disciplined investors do. They focus on cash flow. They're more cash flow driven. They're more community aware, and their mindset is more resilient. Because I believe your property portfolio should give you power, peace, and options. That comes from discipline, structure, and income. No investment is completely immune to change at the end of the day, right? What we're aiming for is resilience. We're aiming for portfolios that don't depend on one government decision. We're aiming for portfolios that can continue producing strong cash flow positive outcomes through changing market environments. Investors can't control elections. They can't control legislations. They can't control everyday policy announcements that come out of Canberra outside of an election. But they can control the assets they buy. They can control the income those assets generate, the advice they get, the housing problems they help solve, and the strength of the position that they build over time. That, my friends, is where I think investors should keep their attention. So let's bring this all together. Tonight, we've discussed the SMSF borrowing changes. We looked at the broader housing conversation. We talked about the reality that Australia needs more rental supply and investors are becoming more cautious. We've talked about policy risk and why investors need to understand. And we've discussed the importance of building portfolios designed to withstand these changing conditions. And whether the practical deadline lands mid-August or slips slightly, based on the final timing of this thing called the Royal Assent, one thing remains true. Preparation expands your options, delay narrows them. So if SMSF investing is something you've been considering, now is the time to have those conversations with your trusted team to understand the timelines. And if you're short on time, want to understand how to build a property portfolio that can outperform through changing market conditions, we've got something coming up that you might want to check out. Our upcoming TLDR, that's right, Too Long Didn't Read, webinar is focused on a 30-minute session designed for busy investors. We'll walk you through the principle behind building an all-weather portfolio, why high cash flow properties are so important right now. We're talking 78 to 250K income. I'll show you how that gets done and how that cash flow safety net helps investors assess whether the deal's got enough breathing room before they commit. So keep an eye out on our page, because if tonight's conversation resonated with you, the webinar is going to help you put all the pieces together. Now, before we wrap up, I've got one favor to ask. A huge number of you who attend these live streams every week, they haven't actually followed our page yet. If that's you, make sure you follow Ethical Property Investments on Facebook and Insta. Every week we share cool market updates, educational content, property strategies. Like our property of the week this week, we're talking circa 900,000 with about a 5% yield in Brisbane, right? Real investor stories and insights designed to help Australians make better investment decisions. So if you're not following the page yet, there's a good chance you're missing on the content that can help you stay informed, make more confident decisions in the future. And thank you for joining me for another episode of Properties and Beers. Have a fantastic evening, and we'll see you next time. Cheers, guys. Cheers, guys.